And they made their way back into their hometown, and as they looked up at the massive, rusty old oil tank that sort of stood sentinel near the edge of their town on the main road, on it they saw a silhouette of an image of a child held in the arms of a larger image of a man who they said looked like Jesus. It was a great comfort to that family. It caused a huge stir in Northwest Ohio. People came from everywhere, and of course, eventually, a lot of religious paraphernalia, t-shirts and mugs were sold. A woman toasted bread, finds the image of Jesus, crusty brown, on its face. A woman in New Mexico, Mrs. Rubio, rolls out a tortilla and throws it on her grill. When she flips it over, there is the perfect representation of a slender, bearded face on the surface of the bread. Mrs. Rubio builds a shrine around it. She quits her job and devotes all of her time to the shrine, to tending the tortilla shrine. Friends, neighbors, even strangers stop by to look at it or to pray in front of it. Mrs. Rubio, who prays nightly in front of the tortilla, has said, "I don't know why this has happened to me, but God has come into my life through this tortilla." In my home congregation, Bethlehem Lutheran in Pemberville, Ohio, there's beautiful stained glass windows that fills the church, but particularly behind the chancel area, which is a very high raised area, many, many steps to get to the actual chancel of it. And jutting out into the congregation on one side, there are two ambos, two places from which a speaker can read, but the pulpit is this massive wooden structure that juts out into the congregation like a dock, waiting for boats to come up and tie off. And just behind that is a little door on the side of the chancel area, which is a domed, almost half rotunda sort of structure. And it's beautiful. It fits right into the woodwork. When it's shut, you hardly know it's there, except that there's a knob on the wall that marks the door. And one of my childhood friends, when we were quite young, believed that Jesus lived behind that door. That was Jesus' house. Every Sunday morning, the pastor and the two acolytes would come out of that door, robed and ready for worship. That's where they entered from. They never went back in at the end, because they always went out the back, like we do at the end of worship, processed out. So she believed that the pastor and the acolytes must be talking to Jesus before the service, and the pastor's learning what he should talk about, what he should preach about on Sunday morning in Jesus' little house. It took great comfort for her, because she thought, even though she never went in that door, that it was a great comfort that Jesus was there in the house just in case of an emergency, And then one day she noticed that the door was open. It was ajar, and she held her breath as she reached for the door, and she stepped into the secret room. It was kind of like our secret room off. Did you know there's a room right off? You can get out there. You can't see the door of it, however. But all she saw in there were old robes and kind of old church decorations. Jesus wasn't there at all. She said it was really a crisis moment of faith for her. In her childish mind, she said she had wondered if Jesus had left our church. And if so, where had he gone? A family takes comfort from the image of Jesus holding what they believe is their now deceased young child. A woman sees the face of Jesus in a piece of toast or in a tortilla. My friend sees a place for God to live in the church. I think we all yearn for God at some point in our life. Maybe we yearn for God our whole lives. Some of us get it kind of knocked out of us. Some of us become skeptical or cynical and stop looking altogether. But some of us keep looking. It's hard because it's hard to read the signs, isn't it? The signs that God leaves behind him for signposts. St. Augustine once posted the following experiment. He said, imagine God saying to you, I'll make a deal with you if you wish. I'll give you anything and everything you ask, pleasure, power, honor, wealth, freedom, even peace of mind and good conscience. Nothing will be a sin to you. Nothing will be forbidden. Nothing will be impossible to you. But you can never look upon my face. The first part of the proposition, Augustine said, was very appealing in his young life. If you know anything about Augustine's young life, he was quite the wild child. And isn't there a part of us, like Augustine, that pleasure-loving part of us that perks up at the thought of a guiltless, endless delight? But then, just as we're about to raise our hands and volunteer for that, we hear a final phrase that works against a deeper longing that's deep within us. You'll never be able to see my face. Augustine said that experiment is life. It's Augustine who would also write to us that our hearts are restless until they find their final rest in God. We yearn to see God, don't we? We yearn for it. It's always surprising to me in an increasingly secular culture that at least once a year, almost every major news magazine will have some kind of article about God or prayer. AARP just this spring had a huge expose on prayer. Newsweek, Time, Life always used to have issues about God or Jesus or the life of the apostles. We long to see God. We may not look for him in tortillas or toast, or we may not look on him on rusty old oil tanks, but we all want to hope that maybe somewhere in our church there is a room in which God resides. We know that though we're in a world of beguiling pleasures all around us, that those things are not enough. We yearn to see God, as did the people who came to see Jesus as they followed him after the feeding on the 5,000. Now, clearly they were impressed by his healings. They were mystified by the fact that he could multiply a little boy's sack lunch and make it into a feast to feed at least 5,000 people. But still their hearts yearned for something more than bread and circuses. They yearned for real answers in their life. They wanted a person who could solve their problems. They wanted a politician or a ruler or a revolutionary. And that's what they were seeing in Jesus, and that's what they wanted to make of him. And this is the reason that Jesus leaves in Mark and John chapter 6. They wanted to find the Messiah. They just weren't sure what they were looking for. Now, in our reading, now this is right after the feeding of the 5,000. It's the next day. Either they're foolish or they're forgetful or something worse. Jesus has just done this miraculous feeding of 5,000. And now they demand a sign to prove what Jesus says about himself, to prove who he is. Now, in John's gospel, there's sort of a literary pattern that you need to be aware of. The pattern is this. There's a sign, which is we would call a miracle, but John doesn't call him that. There's a sign, and then Jesus' interpretation of the sign, followed by a discussion and usually a misunderstanding of what Jesus means, and then the assertion of Jesus of I am. And there's a number of I am statements in the Gospel of John, and today we hear in verse 35 at the end of our reading, I am the bread of life. If you read through John's Gospel, you'll see this pattern repeated over and over again. A sign and Jesus' interpretation, a misunderstanding and a discussion, and a I am statement. The reading that we have today is the interpretation. Last week, in fact the last 2 weeks, we had stories about feeding of 5,000 people with a miraculous small amount of food that Jesus makes into an abundance. The crowd, though, isn't quite getting it. They want to know what they can do to perform the works of God. That's the question. In other words, they're kind of saying, what's the key to this whole life thing, Jesus? And if you miss the answer, you have really missed a colossal claim. You remember what Jesus says the work of God is? The work of God is this, he said, that you would believe in him whom God has sent. That's the work of God, trusting that God has sent Jesus. But they want to know why they should believe in him. Because, you know, Moses, back in the day, in Exodus, did the same thing. There was manna, in fact, quail, and Allie read that lesson to us from Exodus today. You know, Moses kind of did the same thing. In other words, Jesus, you're not really that big a deal because we've seen this trick before. But Jesus pushes them, saying that God, not Moses, God was the one who provided the bread in the wilderness. God was the one who provided liberation. And now God has provided the bread of life. God has provided him. You can imagine how provocative this would be, especially in a culture like ours. When God turns to face us and people make claims about God, don't you turn a little skeptical sometimes? Don't you get a little worried about what's going on for them? We like to explain it away, right? We have our natural reasons, we have our intellectual reasons, we have our skeptical reasons, we have our scientific reasons that God, in the evidence that we have before us, is not there. Humanity seems to be a natural doubter. but also filled with the desire to believe, to transcend the usual answer. True of you, it's true of me. No one is so much alone in the universe as a denier of God, German writer Jean-Paul Richter observed. With an orphaned heart which has lost the greatest of fathers, he stands mourning by the immeasurable corpse of the universe. We yearn to see God. We as a people seem to be incurably religious. They're even talking about a God gene in us, somehow planted in us for who knows what reason. People came to hear Jesus preach and teach. They wanted to be close to God. They had the law, but the law wasn't enough. They had the prophets and the temple and their local synagogue. All these things pointed to God. They were signposts that were pointing to God, but they were not enough. God seemed remote. God seemed impersonal. They needed a bridge to God. God provided one. God provided a feast in the wilderness for them near Capernaum. It was a signpost, but they were terribly bad at reading the map. They needed a means of traversing the great distance between divinity and humanity. I remember a story about the Auca Indians, who were South American Indians, and the missionaries that were there. And of course, translation of languages is always very difficult. And sometimes there's just key words that are missing that translators really need to find in order to make the scripture make sense in the language of the people they're trying to translate for. And there was no equivalent word for the word reconcile in this native language, which is kind of a big word when you're talking about Jesus, you're talking about God, and you're talking about the God of the New Testament. And struggling with how to share the concept, one day the translator was traveling with a band of these native Indians through the jungle, and they came to a narrow ravine, and he thought, well, that's kind of it, we're going to have to double back. And all of a sudden they pulled out their machetes and they began to hack at the bottom of a tree, and this tree fell across the ravine. And it was enough for them to all cross over. And there was a word in that language for felling a tree across a ravine. So they had their word. Tree across a ravine was the word for reconcile. That seems to be what the people are struggling with in Jesus' time. They just can't quite get the metaphor. Yeah, we are the bread of life. Yeah, the man in the wilderness. But we're not quite sure about this. But Jesus is meant to be that kind of tree across the ravine. He's supposed to be reconciling. He's supposed to be bringing the face of God, the incarnation, God with us, right into our faces. Jesus said quite a few things like that. Metaphors pointing, signs pointing to who he was. Anyone who drinks of this water, he said to the Samaritan woman, will never thirst again. She says, Sir, give me this water always. The people, after the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus says, whoever eats this bread will never be hungry again. They say, Lord, give us this bread. And Jesus says, I am the bread of life. I'm the one who comes down from heaven, who gives life to the world. Or later he'll say, I am the good shepherd. I am the door for the sheep. I am the light of the world. I am the resurrection and the life. Signposts. Here's the good news. All these signposts are supposed to help us bridge over to see God reaching for us to our side of the ravine, the tree that crosses. When Jesus made this startling claim, you can see the people squirming. As they would today, you would squirm as well. People listening couldn't believe it, and they begin to grumble. We'll get that next week. They begin to say things like, wait, isn't this a local boy? Hey, don't we know his father was a carpenter, his mother Mary? Don't we know his brothers and his sisters? And they take offense at him because God's too familiar sometimes. God's too in the mix of details, and we're always looking for the 2x4, aren't we? And God is far more subtle than that. And so overlooking God, we miss out on all that God's doing. We can appreciate their confusion, can't we? We can appreciate why they miss it. They watched Jesus grow up. They knew who he was. They could not see the answer before them in their frustrating search for God. It's an extraordinary claim to claim that he is the bread of life. No wonder people who didn't know him intimately couldn't accept it. No wonder they grumbled. No wonder they fell away. Only a few believed, and they would maintain the fellowship with them. They were the ones who followed him to the cross. They were the ones who to whom the risen Christ appeared, they were the ones who wrote down the testimony in the pages of our Bibles. They were the ones who heard his words, saw the things that he did, saw the signpost, and knew the full force of his personality, and they testify to us that he can be believed. And the word here for believe is not simply propositional thought. It's trusting. You can trust him. You can put your weight down in the midst of difficult things upon this one. When you're in a hospital bed, or you're before the altar, or in deep trouble, or in great joy, his life is the one you can step down on, the tree across the ravine that will not break. If you rely upon yourself, John seems to be saying, there's not enough bread to go around. Only with the bread of life. They testify us that he can be believed when he says of himself, no one has seen the Father except the one who is from God. Only he has seen the Father. I tell you the truth, he who believes has everlasting life. Those of you say, those friends of yours that say that, well, Jesus never claimed to be the Son of God in the Bible, they have forgotten to read the Gospel of John. It could not be any more plain who he's saying he is. Mrs. Rubio sees Jesus on the face of a tortilla, another woman on a piece of toast, a family through grieving eyes sees the image of Jesus holding their child. Now these might strike us as silly or superstitious or easily explained away sorts of things, but it's sadder to me that many people have never seen Jesus in the midst of their lives. We've missed him. We hear these claims, and yet they cannot or will not take up the question about the claims he makes of himself. Because he either is or he is not the bread of life. It just comes down to that. St. Augustine tells us something like that happened to him and God as well. He writes in his confession, God was inside me. If you know about Augustine, you know what this means. But I was outside myself, working in the pleasures of the world. And this is how we missed one another. God was inside me, but I was outside myself. And this is how we missed one another. Fortunately, Augustine was able to get back inside of himself where he and God could commune. I hope that you're as fortunate. That second reading from Ephesians is a beautiful one for the church. I should have preached it, but we're already in the bread of life, so I didn't want to miss it. But it's a perfect example of life in the church, about where Christ wants to reside in our lives. You and I, we yearn to see God, and yet we miss the divine appointments with us all the time because we want God to do something like bread by Galilee. And yet we're missing the mountains of bread that God's giving us in thousands of different ways every day. He's here, this man of Nazareth. And in many and various ways, he's providing us with bread as a metaphor to sustain us in all of our life. I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry. Whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. That's a colossal claim, isn't it? Sometimes we expect too little of God. Sometimes expecting the answers that we demand, more bread, like those in the gospel. Therefore, we miss seeing God. And as we look at Jesus in the Gospel of John, we see him time and time again surprising people who underestimate him, like today, shocking people into belief who have given up on God, like the Samaritan woman, and loving people back to life who are loveless and lifeless, like Lazarus. In our search for God, we need to pay attention again to the man from Galilee and listen to his answer when we ask, hey, are you? And he answers, I am. Amen.